Moderator of this panel. I am the director of the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University, one of the co-sponsors of this conference. And before I introduce our panelists, I suppose every moderator has to take the opportunity to flog something that they've produced, so I just wanted to hold up our latest report that we've issued from our institutes, hot off the press last Friday. There's a big stack of them outside. It's called Trade and Travel Patterns at the Canada-U.S. Border, Policy Implications. So please do not hesitate to snag one of those. This session was intended and is intended to, I think it follows nicely on what's happened already this morning. We've heard quite a bit about what's going on at the regional level in the Pacific Northwest in terms of cross-border management, and particularly relevant to the Olympics. And I think somebody in the audience asked a question about how can what's happened in the Pacific Northwest, particularly between governors and premiers, be transferred to other parts of the Canada-U.S. border. And so that's one of the topics that I hope we'll have a chance to address during this panel. But beyond that, what we want to focus on, I think in particular, is how regional solutions, regional innovation can migrate up to the national policy level. It's one thing to say we're able to do these things in particular cross-border regions. It's something else, particularly when you look at some of these daunting national issues having to do with trade and security and immigration. How do these regional solutions find their way up into national policy circles so that there's articulation between the national level and the regional level? And also, I think what we'd like to address, or I hope we can address in this panel or possibly in the questions, is what kinds of shared regional, national models might be out there. What kinds of shared responsibility models might be available for us to look at? Is there a model that has emerged in the Pacific Northwest that might bear some further analysis? And finally, I think we'd also like to look at, and this was mentioned briefly in the last panel, the role of what we might call catalytic events in pulling border regions together. Now, obviously, the Olympics has proven to be a kind of catalytic event in terms of what it's done by way of generating increased border cooperation, cross-border cooperation in the Pacific Northwest. Are there other such catalytic events, or what about negative catalytic events? For example, what about the decline in the auto sector? What may that mean in terms of cross-border cooperation? So these are just some of the questions that we thought would be interesting to explore, either in the presentations or in the discussion that will follow. I'm under strict orders to limit everybody to about 8 minutes, so I will keep time. And let me quickly introduce, I won't read the entire bios, but quickly introduce each of our four panelists. To my immediate left, we have Christopher Sands, who's probably well known to this group, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and of course a well-known specialist on Canada and Canada-U.S. relations. Sitting next to Chris, we have Edward Alden, who is the Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, a former Washington Bureau Financial Times person, and also, I think, probably and certainly from my perspective, what I know most about Ted is his recent book called Closing of the American Border, which has created quite an interesting stir among border lookers or border scholars and practitioners. We have sitting next to Ted Kelly Johnston, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs of Campbell Soup Company. And Kelly has a very interesting background in government in Washington, D.C. And one of the things I noticed in reading his bio is he was at one time the Senate's Chief Administrative and Financial Officer. So it might be an interesting background in terms of somebody now who is running a major food company in North America. And finally, sitting at the far end of the table is Michelle James, who was the Director of Field Operations at the Seattle Field Office for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. A few people asked earlier, what do these acronyms stand for? CBP is Customs and Border Protection. And I should say that Michelle's field extends from Washington State all the way to North Dakota. So her management responsibilities cover an enormous territory. So we're very pleased that Michelle could join us on this panel. So without further ado, let me simply turn it over. We're going to go out of order a little bit because Chris got here late and he's just catching his breath. So we'll start with Ted Alden.
Great. Thank you very much, Don. And I want to thank Chris Sands, actually, for suggesting my name for this event. This actually feels like something of a homecoming for me. I was born in the United States in New York, but my family moved to Vancouver when I was very young. And so I grew up in Vancouver. Actually, the high school that I went to, Premier Campbell's mom was the office manager at the high school. And I spent my formative years going back and forth across the border at Peace Arch constantly. My dad had a hobby that took him down to Washington State. So my memories of the border at that time are quite different from the current reality. Going into the United States was easy. They would just wave at you. And coming back into Canada was always a challenge because this was pre-FTA, pre-NAFTA. And they thought for sure that you were trying to smuggle back stuff that you'd bought in the malls in Bellingham. And, if you only went away for 24 hours, you were limited to bringing $40 worth of stuff back in one bottle of wine. So we got very creative at hiding things in different parts of the cars and things like that. If there are any Canadian border officials here, I'm sure the statute of limitations on that one is exhausted. So I feel, I feel very much a personal stake in a border that works, particularly in that region. I am going to talk in this presentation more about problems and obstacles to cooperation than about solutions, and that's not to downplay the importance of solutions, and I think that's what this conference is about. But I want to suggest some of what you're up against. I brought along 4 slides to underscore the obstacles that the U.S. and Canada face in trying to develop cooperative ways to manage the border. I mean, there is a shared goal here. The shared goal is what is known as the smart border, one that serves to keep out terrorists and serious criminals and other threats, yet allows for the free and efficient movement of goods and people across the border that are so important for the Canadian and U.S. economies. Canada and the United States were pioneers in the development of the smart border after 9/11. One of the chapters in my book concerns that. But I worry that some of the initiative on that is actually being lost. And these slides will suggest why. The first 3 slides come from a document that was prepared recently by Joint Task Force North, which is part of the U.S. Northern Command that was developed after 9/11 to give the U.S. military a more structured role in Homeland Security, a support role to what DHS and other agencies are doing. It was published briefly and apparently inadvertently on the agency's website. They've since pulled it down. What strikes me about this briefing, which was prepared for a senior Northcom official, is the extremely broad and diffuse definition of the threats at the border. We start here just with the northern border in the first slide. Some of the threats that are illuminated here, as you can see up on the slide, include Canadian immigration policies, which create, quote, an environment favorable to special interest aliens, which is the term for citizens of one of about any 24 countries that are thought to have significant al-Qaeda or other terrorist presence. If you look at the bottom there, it says, the large SIA population in eastern Canada presents the greatest potential for foreign terrorists' access to the U.S. homeland. On the other side of the continent, you'll see there, primary route for ecstasy and BC bud marijuana crossing in the west. And then there's a reference there in the top under alien smuggling organizations to the hundreds of landing strips and unguarded crossings that provide potential entry points. So this is kind of the landscape of U.S. military concerns about the various threats on the northern border. Let me add to it a little bit. This is a more detailed slide, again, from the same briefing on northern border threat approaches. So that goes into a little more detail on each of the areas in the previous slide. It points out, for instance, potential alien smuggling routes across the northern border and the particular vulnerability of the native Indian reservations that straddle the border. That's more the case in eastern Canada, of course, than in western Canada. And then I'll move quickly here to a third slide, which is the overall North American viewpoint. I'm struck by this slide in a number of respects. It claims that of the 3,987 miles of Canadian land border, precisely 0 miles are considered controlled, and only 21 miles are deemed to be managed. The rest is at best monitored. The only comfort in this slide from a Canadian perspective, I suppose, is that the southwest border with Mexico looks a lot worse. The range of threats down there include the 25 million Mexicans living on $1 a day or less. The notion that there's a Hezbollah presence in Mexico, which there have been questions raised about that, but there's certainly some evidence of that. I find it amazing. We've got on the U.S.-Mexico border 76 miles that are considered controlled. Well, since we're getting very close to having built 700 miles of fence on that border, it makes me wonder a little bit what the point of fencing is if it doesn't succeed in buying you control on that border. There are many things that when I saw this presentation that disturbed me about this presentation. And some of the assumptions here, I think, about the Hezbollah presence in Mexico or the differences between Canada and the U.S. in dealing with visitors and immigrants from Muslim countries, I think are really overstated. I mean, Canada was actually well before the United States, after, within a week after September 11th, started special monitoring procedures for visitors and immigrants coming from Muslim countries. I mean, Canada did that before the United States did. So I have some questions about some of the premises of this document. But what disturbs me most, and I think should disturb this audience, is what it says about how some in the U.S. government, and I repeat here some, view the borders. The borders are seen as the best way to control a great mass of threats that actually have little to do with one another. On the one hand, you're talking about terrorism, an extremely serious, consequential threat involving a small number of people. But we're throwing into that drug smuggling, which is a much larger universe, a less serious threat, though arguably still a threat. And then also illegal immigration from Mexico, which is not, in conventional military terms, a threat at all. It's a problem, but it's not a threat in the way we think of those things normally. And we've reached a situation, I fear, where the United States sees border control as the primary way to deal with all these threats that actually, in reality, have little to do with one another. In a recent article in the magazine Canada Watch that I wrote, I've termed this the quest for the perfectly secure border, one which can somehow keep out all of these bad things. It can't, but the effort to do so has been, and I fear promises to be even more disruptive for all of the law-abiding cross-border traffic that is so vital to prosperity. So this gets us back to the smart border. I mean, doesn't the answer to this problem lie in exactly what we're talking about in this conference, exactly what's been happening between British Columbia and Washington State? Information and intelligence sharing, advanced data, separating high-risk from low-risk traffic through the Nexus and fast lanes. All of these different initiatives I've written about in my book and you're well aware of. And I think it is the answer. But the last slide I'm going to share with you is a recent unofficial DHS evaluation of where Canada stands on some of the information sharing initiatives that the United States cares most about. So this slide is comparing Canada with the visa waiver countries. From a security perspective, the visa waiver countries have really been very, very high, perhaps at the top of the U.S. list of concerns, because there are obviously radical Muslim groups in visa waiver countries, particularly in Europe. And there's been a lot of effort put into making sure that the United States gets detailed, advanced information on people coming from visa waiver countries to the United States. So if you look at the list on the left, you've got now ESTA, which is electronic travel authorization, which was just recently put in place, where DHS gets well in advance of people coming to the United States basic passenger information. Advanced manifests, again, these are for people getting on airplanes. The information is shared with the U.S. government in advance. Visa waiver countries are sharing their terrorist watch lists. They're sharing their criminal data. They have developed secure passports. And when they come to the United States, those individuals are fingerprinted under U.S. visit. So these are the recent entrants among the incumbents, the older VWP countries. Also quite a bit of progress, though still issues there. And you compare now Canada, particularly the land border, which is the biggest concern here. Obviously, no electronic system of travel authorization. Canadians are free to come across the border when they want to without providing advance. Advanced manifest, similar thing. That's happening in the air environment now. So the U.S. gets that data on flights coming from Canada, but you can't do that, or at least it's not done yet at the land border. Sharing of terrorist lists. We talked briefly about privacy issues on the previous panel. There are some reasons why Canada is very reluctant to share its terrorist watch list with the United States, and Canada believes that the United States should trust Canada to implement its own system for people entering Canada as a kind of a part of a North American perimeter. So that's not there, and the United States would like that. Sharing criminal data, yes, that's done. Secure IDs, we've talked a lot about that this morning. We're moving towards that, good progress being made. We're going to be at least some of the way there by this summer when WHTI goes into effect. And then finally, U.S. visit fingerprints. We forget that there is a congressional mandate here that calls for the creation of an entry-exit system at all U.S. borders. Congress didn't mandate that it had to be biometric, but DHS decided under Secretary Ridge that it would be biometric. So at some point, if that project continues, the United States wants to get biometrically fingerprint information for everybody who enters and exits the country. I mean, there are a lot of clever ways to do this with RFID. It may well be possible. But potentially the disruptions of this are much bigger than what we've seen already. So just to conclude, what this adds up to, I fear, is that we may well be looking at more tightening in the future rather than loosening as a result of smart border initiatives. Many of these issues are ones on which Canada is going to be reluctant to cooperate on U.S. terms. Minister Lunn recommended pre-clearance, and the two governments just could not work out a protocol that allowed them to cooperate on pre-clearance. And the United States, so far at least, and this could change perhaps with the new administration, so far has been unwilling to trust that Canada is doing everything it needs to do to keep terrorists out. So this is a big list of challenges, and I want to commend the work that's being done in the Pacific Northwest. I think these are vital, and I think these regional initiatives are crucial to trying to find clever and sophisticated ways out of some of these problems. But don't underestimate the problems. They are big and continuing ones. And I will stop there.
Thanks, Ted. Move on to Chris Sands.
Well, one thing, and I would never want to correct his presentation, but you should show them the book.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Chris. My book.
Got to do a plug
it's
here.
slumping on Amazon, so if anybody feels like buying it, that would be good for my ratings.
This is why he's in academia. He's not a self-promoter, but we'll get him. We'll get him. Sure. I thank you very much, and I appreciate being invited here as well. And I'm going to pick up right where Ted's presentation left off, because in a lot of ways, what I'd like to focus on is the challenge of trying to fix border issues in this current environment, and pick on some of the themes that Don introduced us with. Some of you will remember that back in 1996, when the Congress passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, the U.S. For the first time mandated, or Congress mandated, that we would have entry-exit controls of the border. And for those of you around in 94, 95 working in Washington, you'll remember that the 94 election gave us both the Gingrich Congress and Proposition 187 in California, which made immigration, particularly southern border immigration, a politically salient issue. It was in that debate that we had a couple of things that have been with us ever since sort of emerge. One was the realization that when we asked people to leave the country, we didn't always know if they did. And members of Congress, in their fine way of feigning and sometimes exaggerating outrage, were outraged that we had told people, including known criminals, to leave, and we didn't even know if they'd left yet. We also started running into the political salience of Hispanics in the United States. And Congress began to say, well, we can't do something for the Mexican border if we don't do it also to the Canadian border, because it would be considered to be racial discrimination. We'd be picking on the Hispanics, not picking on those nice, pasty Canadians. And the legacy of the 96 debate, in that sense, is a significant one. And with us still, it set in motion for a huge lobbying effort on the part of a lot of different people who suddenly realized the border wasn't just some sort of demarcation line off in the distance, but it affected their livelihood in a way that NAFTA by itself and the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement hadn't done. A lot of people who live in border communities, whether it's Detroit or Buffalo or El Paso or San Diego, began realizing the impact of the border positively and negatively on their economy, on their own future, on their entertainment options. I grew up in Detroit, and Windsor had some nice restaurants, better place to watch the fireworks from. We used to go back and forth all the time, and I'm old enough to remember that Michigan's drinking age was actually lower than Ontario's, and so I wasn't one of those who went across for that, but my brother did, so anyway. But people started to realize that the border after 1996 was not only a source, was now going to be questioned, and the old way of border life was coming under some scrutiny. Something else that came out of the 96 border change. Of course, we didn't get entry-exit controls fully implemented, but we had a really good dialogue on the Canada-U.S. border. We began to recognize the importance of stakeholders. Some of you will remember this series of initiatives that went from the fully federal to the more local, the Border Vision Initiative, the Shared Border Accord, the Canada-U.S. Partnership, which was perhaps the most willing to engage stakeholders, the Anti-Smuggling Working Group, the Cross-Border Crime Forum, a series of dialogues that got some of the people who suddenly realized the border mattered involved in talking about what kind of border that they wanted. What was it that needed to change? They knew that some negative changes were coming, but they also wanted to say, well, this is what we value about living at the border, at least on the northern border. And out of that, when we had the tragedy of September 11 in the United States, the attack, we had a blueprint. And I think we're fortunate in a lot of ways that the Canadians realized that. And John Manley and others on the Canadian side came forward with a roadmap for fixing the border, which we think of now as the Smart Border Declaration and Action Plan that gave us a way of trying to make improvements. Now, by 2004, much of the Smart Border Action Plan was either done or well on its way. And we found ourselves needing to renew the dialogue, but there was no automatic renewal mechanism in the Smart Border Accords. 2 points. Why did it work so well? It worked so well because it followed on a consensus between the parties. Not only a consensus between the feds on both sides of the Canada-U.S. border, but a consensus that included the local stakeholders. It also separated the U.S. and Canadian borders again. There was a separate Smart Border Action Plan for Mexico. Not that it was markedly weaker, but that it allowed Mexico and the U.S. to set an agenda that they could work on. And the two, although related, were not chained at the ankles. So therefore they could move at their own pace, which was constructive and helpful, I think, in a lot of ways. By 2004, we realized we needed to renew this border dialogue. We came up with, as some of you also remember, the Security and Prosperity Partnership, a way of having a security dialogue, 20 working groups looking at a range of issues, not just the border, but many of the things that Ted identified in terms of our mutual security. It was a mechanism that had some merit. It was technocratic. It put power in the hands of people who were actually working on these issues to deal with technical matters, but it had a couple of deficits compared to what we'd had after '96. One was it linked Canada and Mexico again. Not that they shouldn't have some connection, but it did mean that we were now a bit more chained. And secondly, it excluded all those stakeholders who had been sort of brought into the process after '96, whose consensus on what we should do at the border made border improvements possible. So we find ourselves now, at the beginning of the Obama period, trying to rediscover some of the good ideas we've already had about the border, fix some of the consequences of the changes on the border that were good changes but made in haste and needed to be refined. We need that second generation of refinement and reform. But we come to this at a difficult time. And I want to talk about, since borders are about frontiers and frontiers are essentially limits, I want to talk about some of the limits, if that's not redundant, of dealing with a border in the current moment. I'm not going to dwell on them because they're going to be obvious the minute I tell you them. First is funding. I know we're spending bazillions of dollars a day now. Washington doesn't seem to have limits on spending. And many border projects are shovel-ready, so we're excited about that. My father likes to say all of Detroit is shovel-ready, so... but there's plenty of shoveling to do, and there is funding. But funding is going to be a constraint. And when you go beyond big infrastructure projects, there are going to be concerns, I think, moving forward, that if we want to do big, new, expensive things, there just won't be the dollars. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on the federal level especially to start looking for ways to economize, and I think that's important. Second, even more scarce than billions of your dollars, political capital. This new administration has spent a lot of political capital to work on the stimulus. They have a handful of key priorities. I think there's an openness to deal with the border, but there's a reality, which is there's a limited ability of this president and his administration to rally Congress behind legislative changes that may be necessary. So they're going to have to pick their battles carefully. Not that the administration can't do things, but it's got to be careful. Next, political energy. There's so many global problems. You read about them in the paper every day. You know, war abroad, crisis at home, banks, car companies, everyone going out of business, as Don mentioned. So how much political energy is there to fix problems at the border? How many politicians will stake their time, their career, their re-election hopes on really working on these particular issues? Another challenge we have is part of the new world of the Department of Homeland Security, and one aspect of it which I think is underappreciated north of the border is that really in many ways DHS is an agency that is creating one border. It doesn't want to have one border policy for Canada that's a light rule and then one border policy for Mexico that's harsh rule. It wants to be able to have harmonious border policies and be able to move personnel around among borders, have consistent systems, whether they're computer systems and others, so that it can manage the borders more efficiently. It has, in effect, one mandate, which is to secure American citizens. So why would it have anything but a one border strategy? But this means it's going to be difficult to decouple without a careful rationale Canadian and Mexican realities. And that, I think, is an important limit on what we can do, especially for people, I'll come to this in a minute, who are dreaming of the pre-Bush border coming back, the PBB. I could call it the pre-9/11 border, but, people respect 9/11 in a way that they don't respect the old president, so we'll just call it the PBB for now. The other thing, which is, I think, a limit, and it matters, thank you, Don, is the fact that our border now has some key constituencies. And some of the folks I know in Canada have talked about now what we have to do is eliminate all the border guards, go back to a light border. No, those are federal jobs in depressed communities. They're not going anywhere. And we've built infrastructure. The buildings are still going to be there. There are now more, we used to call them freight forwarders. I guess we still do. There are more people involved in the process of helping to expedite commercial traffic. There are companies that have made expensive adjustments to live with this border. So there's, in effect, a vested set of constituencies on the border that are going to resist change or want to be a part of change, and that's going to be a powerful limit. And importantly, we have a Bush legacy, which I don't want to understate, and that legacy is no second terrorist attacks since September 11 on American soil. Don't think that doesn't weigh very heavily on the Obama administration as they look at changes in Guantanamo and elsewhere. They know that they're inheriting the security responsibility. It may not be that letting someone go from Guantanamo leads to an attack from Canada on the United States. Let's hope it isn't. But the connection may be made in the public mind. Being good stewards on national security is an important factor for this administration. So you shouldn't expect them to say, hey, we're not Bush, so we're for a happy, open border. They've got to be careful. Their reelection counts on it, but also their sense of taking care of the national security of this country counts on it. So with all of that, you're probably depressed and say, well, what's the point of this conference? We're going nowhere fast. I think there are three keys out of that, and I have maybe, I'm already 20 seconds over, so I'm going to give you these three keys, and we'll talk about them in the Q&A. First, I think it's incumbent on us when we make recommendations, we try to move forward to be precise. The idea that it's just some sweeping get rid of the passport requirement will all be better is not going to work. We have to talk about what's the problem at Seattle, between Seattle and Vancouver. What's the problem for Detroit in the auto sector? What's the problem for particular users, particular industries? What's the problem for particular regions? Is our biggest problem the rural border in between the big cities, some of that uncontrolled space that Ted identified? But when you have a problem, you have to be very particular about where it is. Secondly, I think we need to go back to something we talked about before September 11, which is decentralization. We need to empower local communities, and that includes local port directors of Customs and DHS, to be able to have some flexibility to manage the crazy fireworks weekend in Detroit or the Olympics. We need to give them power, not to lower border standards, but to make sure they can move personnel and budget around to meet local needs. And when they don't need a nexus lane, in Sweetwater or Sweetgrass, between Alberta and Montana, then they don't have an nexus lane, or they only operate it sometimes a day. I think we need to give them that flexibility when we can. And lastly, a bit further out, I think the challenge incumbent on all of us is to rebuild consensus between Canadians and Americans about what kind of border we want. We're all doing triage now. We're trying to fix problems that are in front of us. Perfectly logical. But as we move forward a decade out, we need to have an idea where we're going. And a decade out is only a little beyond this administration if they get 2 terms. So it's not unrealistic to begin thinking about that now. But building for the long term, which is coming on us very fast. With that, let me stop.
Thank you very much, Chris. Moving on to Kelly.
Borrow that clicker there. Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting us today. This is a terrific session. I've learned a lot already. I also want to mention one aspect of my bio that's important here, because I happen to serve as vice chair of the Canadian American Business Council. Scotty's here. You've heard from her. It's a terrific organization. I'm honored to be a part of it, and we're a real leader in trying to bring focus these kinds of issues from the private sector perspective. So I wanted to give that little short commercial. I'm going to be real brief because I just have one major agenda item. You've heard some great speakers today, some great ideas. I want to leave you with one idea I hope is provocative enough that you'll carry it with you, especially if you haven't worked for the U.S. government. So I'm going to leave that behind in a minute. I also want to praise Senator Grafstein, who's here as well, who leads, of course, as he mentioned, the Canadian delegation for the U.S.-Canada Interparliamentary Union. I had the great pleasure of helping to help staff that organization as Secretary of the Senate back in the late Cretaceous period. So I just want to thank you for your work in that. And I've been on those sessions. It's the most robust interparliamentary union there is in the whole U.S. government. So I just want to commend you for that. And I'm thrilled that you've been to ports of entry. Every time I visit with a U.S. congressman or senator on these issues, I always say, please go to the border. Leave your official passport behind, put on your tennis shoes, go as a tourist, and see what we deal with. Because if you go on an official trip, you get special treatment. It doesn't count, and we don't get that. So that's why I'm really pleased. I also want to, I heard Minister Lund say he was not in Nexus. I am, and I'm proud of it.
There you go.
I happen to really like the Nexus program. It's not perfect, and it's not easy to get a card. It shouldn't be, but it's a terrific program, and it has saved me. I travel from Philadelphia, where I live, to Canada and back probably 8-10 times a year, so I probably don't have to have this card, but I figured out that for a $55 investment, it saved me about 10 hours of waiting in lines at airports, so I'm a real believer in the Nexus program, so I just wanted to mention that to you as well. I also want to just tell you a little about Campbell Soup Company. I'll go right away just to give you a 30-second idea, because it'll help preface my comments about my one big idea I want to leave with you. There are actually several, but I want to leave one big one with you. We're an $8 billion company. We're probably number 14 on the S&P 500 list of food companies. We look at North America as a single market. If you pick up a Campbell Soup annual report, you won't see a U.S. business model, or you won't see a Canadian business reference. You'll see a North American business reference. That's how we view that market. We have a very highly integrated supply chain. People in Ontario are eating Campbell's soup made in Toronto with California tomatoes. People in Florida are eating vegetable soup from one of our new V8 line of soups with carrots from Ontario. So we have a very highly integrated North American market. We ship over 8,000 trucks a year across the border. A lot of trucks come from Canada into the U.S. from Ontario. We have a lot of trucks that go from Ohio into Canada, as well as we have a very robust little food service plant in Everett, Washington, that ships a lot of food service products from there into western and central Canada. So on any given day, we're our Pepperidge Farm business. We have wheat from North Dakota, sometimes wheat from Manitoba. You just don't quite know because of the nature of our market. So to give you an idea. We also were real pleased to be a member of the North American Competitors Council. We technically still are, waiting to see if that's going to continue on in the new administration. It's a major issue, and Chris, thanks for bringing that up. I really appreciate it. Just to tell you that the biggest obstacle from our view, and it's not just a Campbell view, but I think it's especially true in the auto industry, which is the only industry above food and ag in terms of volume of trade between the U.S. and Canada, in terms of the complexity. These are the number of documents that it's a maximum. It can be less, depending on what you're shipping across. This gives you an idea of the complexity of the number of forms or documents or information you have to file every time your ingredient, your product has to cross the border. And this adds up to a tremendous amount of time, no matter how good our customs broker may be on helping to expedite this, no matter how important or how efficient the customs may be in processing, you still have to produce this data. And every time we add new data, we're literally adding, in some cases, millions of dollars of cost in terms of just trying to process this information to meet U.S. requirements. We continue to feel the effect of increasing fees. In the 6 years I've been at Campbell Soup Company, we now have a new APHIS fee, which we have to pay for every time a truck crosses the border. It's not necessarily paid by us. Our truckers pay for it. It's gotten so bad in some cases that now we have truckers who now, at least not recently, but in previous years, have refused our business. So it's just gotten to be too complex. Takes too much time. The border delays, so I don't want your business. Or if you do, I want to charge you a surcharge to do my business. So it clearly, and what it ultimately does, and this is why I think the SPP was created. It really gives Canadian, especially medium and small-sized companies, but even U.S. companies, it really gives, it treats us as a competitive disadvantage in terms of being able to operate, especially if we want to export to markets outside our region. That was what the SPP was supposed to be about. I just want to make a plug here that the SPP, while it didn't really accomplish a great deal of things, it's set in motion. The hard spade work has been done. We've done the shovel work, if you will, to get this process moving. And I think we put together a great report from the NAC on ideas and how we can really improve the efficiency of crossing the border, but also just doing business across the border. And I think it would be really important, and I really do hope that the Prime Minister, who now is the senior North American leader, we have a new president, a fairly new president of Mexico. It's a great time, especially if they continue to meet on a trilateral or bilateral basis, to keep this process alive, even if it is bilateral. And I understand there are huge differences between Mexico and the U.S. and Canada and the U.S. I'm happy either way. But this process, I think, is poised to be successful with some good leadership from the White House as well as from the PM's office in Canada as well as Mexico. Here's my idea slide. And I really want to focus on the first one. And it's just a suggestion for a pilot project. It didn't get a real good reception during the Bush administration until the last days when it was too late to do anything about it. But I do want to suggest it, and it's a good example in our industry. In the food industry, we have, for example, you heard me talk earlier about the fact that we have a plant in Toronto that ships to the U.S. market. Probably about 40% of what we make there goes to the U.S., rest stays in Canada. And we have, for the products that do move from Canada to the U.S., we have a Canadian Food Inspection Agency, CFIA, official who acts on behalf of the FDA or the USDA with a memorandum of understanding. And he or she actually inspects on behalf of the U.S. government those products that are made for the U.S. market at that plant. It seems to me that one way we could really make the border more efficient and free it up for visitors to cross the border would be to try conceptually to move some of the customs processes at the border back to some of these facilities that are within a close proximity of the border. You know, it's not just 80% of the people in Canada who live within an hour of the U.S. or 2 hours of the U.S. border. It's actually 80% of the manufacturing that crosses the borders also operates within close proximity of the border. Which, maybe for a small fee that some companies I think would be willing to pay, we could have some of the processes done at the border done at our manufacturing plants. For example, instead of having us put a seal on the back of a truck that goes to a port of entry to have it cut and then reopen it, check it, close it back up again, why can't you put the actual seal at the border or on the truck at the plant? So it makes the job of the customs inspector at the port of entry at the Peace Bridge, the Ambassador's Bridge, so much easier. Just one thought, and I want to suggest that, and we'd be very happy to participate in that kind of pilot project. So I just wanted to convey that to you as well. Thank you again for having me. I'll stop here, and I'll look forward to your questions and discussion later.
Thanks very much, Kelly. You actually had 1 minute left, but we'll use it in the Q&A.
I yield, in the Senate parlance, I yield back the balance of my time.
That's rare in these kinds of conferences. Michelle.
I may have to borrow that 1 minute. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I do appreciate the invite to talk with you. What I really want to focus on today are some of the initiatives that we have ongoing in the Blaine area in particular. Most of it is relative to the 2010 Olympics. I think what you will find is that the Olympics have been the catalyst in most cases on some of the initiatives that I'm going to talk about, but not in all. Some of these initiatives we are pushing out on the national level, but what I've been able to do is utilize the Olympics as my reason to push up some of my ports of entry in priority order to implement those particular initiatives in my area. And as Dawn said, my area of responsibility is not just the Blaine area. It's from Washington State all the way over to Minnesota. So there's 67 ports of entry there. And where I do find good practices, I do try to push those out to all of the ports where I reasonably can. Today, what I do want to focus on some of the things that we are doing right now, coordination efforts, facilities, resources, and other initiatives. Before I do that, I need to go back to what our key mission is within Customs and Border Protection, and that's securing America's borders to protect the American people and the economy by preventing the entrance of terrorists or implements of terror into the United States while facilitating legitimate trade and travel. So it's not just about wait times. It's about our twin goals of facilitation and security. And I think you heard that over and over again. There's got to be that balanced approach, and that's really what we're trying to do now. For Olympic preparation, field operations fully recognizes that we have a key role in ensuring security and facilitation of the passengers, cargo, and merchandise entering into the United States during those particular events. And we're focused on ensuring that no individuals enter into the country to conduct any kind of terrorist, criminal activities or enter into the country to live illegally. We will certainly operate under a heightened awareness during the events, but bottom line is this is what we do day in and day out. Over the past couple of years, we have participated fully in the Olympic Committee meetings and the different planning sessions within Washington State. Over the last year, I've stepped up the focus on port readiness. To me, that was the key. How are we going to respond in the ports of Blaine, Sumas, Linden, to the effects of the World Police Games or the Olympics? We do partner continuously with CBSA on a day-to-day basis on our operations and the Olympic preparation. We've also participated in the Canadian and U.S. Olympic exercises that have been conducted. We're ensuring that we have strong border response plans in place to any kind of critical incident that occurs on the border. And to test that out, we work through various exercises with a variety of our partners out there. I think, actually, I probably could have taken Congressman Larson's whole beginning speech. He did talk about a lot of key things that we are doing. One of the main developments we have been involved in heavily with field operations is the establishment of the Operations Center in Bellingham, Washington. This particular center is really going to be some of the glue that holds the state, local, and federal entities together during the Olympic, the World Police Games and the Olympic Games. We'll utilize that facility to share situational awareness and coordination during those games. We have engaged heavily with groups like PNWER, IMTC, and I think truly our partnerships over the last several years have really been beneficial to us. We listen to what a lot of our stakeholders are saying that we need to do. And I think a question was raised this morning on the how do we pave the way for continuity of issues when we see that there are a variety of departures, key chiefs or port directors. I think our involvement with these groups have really been able to intertwine us with state, local, federal, and other business entities that are out there. So I think we've seen a lot of benefits over the past few years in just that cooperation. Let me touch on facilities a little bit. Yes, we all know Peace Arch will not be completed for the Olympic Games. For the World Police Games specifically, we will have 4 booths in operation, just like we did this past summer. The other side of the building will be utilized for northbound traffic into Canada. There's no way around that. For the Olympic Games, we will have 10 booths available. They will not be 10 booths spread across. The configuration right now is a bit unknown. GSA is still working on part of that plan, but there will be 10 booths. It may be 8 across and 2 stacked forward, or it'll be 7 across and 3 stacked forward. But in anticipation of the fewer booths that we will have available, there was a strategic plan put in place that we were trying to push some of the traffic to some of the other Cascade crossings. So for Sumas and Linden, they both have an emergency bypass lane. We're going to establish that emergency bypass lane into a fully functional passenger lane with the booth and all the technology in place. So that's 100% throughput in each one of those locations. We'll additionally take the commercial truck booth, which is a high truck booth, and we're establishing that into a high-low truck booth. So we have a little bit more versatility in how we process vehicles. We can, when there's no commercial trucks running through, we can push passenger vehicles through. So that's great additional throughput for us. RFID technology will be deployed to the 4 Cascade crossings by spring of 2009. So those are great benefits for those areas, not just for the Olympics, but future-wise. I think there was a mention of them being temporary, but they're not temporary. They're going to be permanent. So those will stay in place. And that was funding that was put forward from our headquarters strategically for additional throughput during that time frame. What are we doing on the national level? I think what we're trying to do across the board in all land border ports of entry is look at our operation and try to build smarter and more efficiently. So whether or not we put stacked booths out there for more throughput or tandem lanes, which allows us to kind of confine an area but still have 100% throughput in each lane, or using the high-low truck booth concept for more versatility. Our port directors and other field directors for field operations are trying to look at working more efficiently within our ports of entry. The stimulus package will bring us $700 million to put towards improvements to land border facilities. $400 million for CBP-owned facilities and $300 million for GSA facilities. We don't know which facilities those are at this point in which the money will go toward, but that will be a huge improvement to our land border ports of entry. Resources. I continue to continuously look at my staffing levels, specifically in the Blaine area for the 2010 Olympics. We will bring in additional officers if necessary for ensuring that all of the booths are manned at all peak hours. Since July 2008, we have seen an increase in officers in Blaine by 48 officers. In fiscal year 2009, I anticipate having 35 additional officers above where we are at this point. 1 minute, man. Okay.
That's my minute too, by the way.
With his too. Okay.
30 seconds.
All right. Let's see. What else can I hit on that's really going to be most important? Where we've tried to really focus is also on pushing forward on our outreach, whether it be for Nexus, cooperating with Department of Licensing, on pushing forward their EDL message. We have seen a lot of progress in the increase in that type of participation. See, this blew my whole thing because now I've got about a list more. But we are seeing a lot of really good progress in the area. We're going to keep pushing forward and keep working with our partners out there because I think you people bring a lot of good ideas, good initiatives to us. And I can't remember who it was over here who said that there's a lot of good ideas that that wouldn't cost anything. I'd be happy to sit down and talk with you even further. Maybe some of the other questions that are raised will bring out some of these other points.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. We've got about 10, almost 15 minutes, so let's go for questions. This gentleman right here, please bring the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Brian Massey, Member of Parliament from Windsor, Ontario. Really important discussion and this really good panel. I've lived on the border all my life and been dealing with this night and day, and it's been very good suggestions, especially the Border Commission idea. Maybe you can expand a little bit on that. Our region has 4 crossings. We're adding a 5th, and we don't even have a Border Commission because we have private ownership of the Ambassador Bridge, the largest one. So we have, it's really chaos in a sense. And as well, too, I wanted to commend Mr. Sansa for mentioning about the type of border we need to have a discussion about. We've had different experiences. When Timothy McVeigh blew up the Oklahoma City building, we didn't assume every white Christian male coming from Michigan was a terrorist threat. But now what we have in our area is we have a lot of racial profiling, and we're losing a grip. I've talked to nausea about the economic issues that we're dealing with, hurting ourselves this way. But also, too, is we're losing our personal relationships that are so strong. Family members no longer come back and forth that they used to. We're missing out on business relationships that really delve deep into really where we come from as a people. Because in my area, we're people that came to Canada from the United States, and we have those strong bonds. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that, because I think that we're losing that cultural element that doesn't get the attention because of the economic issues we continue to push, but we just simply can't get them through. Thank you.
Couple of quick responses.
Well, just to say, I remember that. I remember that aspect of the border as well, and I think that, the first response in a lot of ways is always to make sure everybody's safe, and then once you've made sure people are safe, you take another look at the policies and say, how can we recapture some of those things? I remember when the passport requirement was first proposed, a lot of good people came forward and said, what about school groups going to a museum? And the kids are expensive to get a passport for, and school groups are always chaotic. Teachers always complain. They've got to organize 30 kids, and there's the one who's picking his nose in the back and never gets anything, never takes parents' notes home, and so on. So I think that DHS responded to that and said, okay, well, under 15s, is it 15, ma'am? 16, I'm sorry. We can do that with, we can be flexible. I think that that's where SPP, which I also think has been really a good initiative, has been a little short. And I think we've left the stakeholders out. And not on purpose. I think we had a lot of things to talk federal, but because I think we need to be precise about problems, not general. It's not about the border, it's about your border, it's about Don's border. Because I think that we need to build consensus, I think decentralization and engagement of stakeholders is the way to go. And I don't know about free ideas. My ideas always cost a little bit, but I'm a nonprofit, so you can take it off your taxes. But I do think we need to engage people and get them more involved in the border. I won't say anything about Kwame Kilpatrick and his border crossing exploits because that didn't end well. But otherwise, we do need to encourage that.
Just to follow up, you mentioned the Joint Border Commission. I do want to thank, I want to give CABC and Scotty the credit for that idea. And it hasn't gotten a ton of traction because it requires two things. One is overcoming, I think, the false argument that there's somehow a loss of sovereignty by having a commission that may actually have some decision-making authority and some resources behind it to be able to help expedite some of these projects. Having said that, I do think that you and I both know, you know more than I, frankly, how long it takes to get a new border crossing project accomplished. If it happens in our lifetime, it's kind of a major miracle. So this is a way for us to, combine resources, delegate authority, which is always difficult for governments to do, but delegate authority in a responsible way to entities that can help expedite these decisions and help make these things actually happen.
Let's go here and then over to Scotty.
Well, first of all, I want to commend the panel. I found it. I keep learning more and more and more about the things that I thought I knew, and I want to congratulate all of you. It's been very informative. Two issues. One, the Campbell Soup example, and I think it's one of the best, most productive companies in the world, and they have a problem. Their problem is that because they have to cross the border dozens of times to integrate as automobiles do, 26,000 moving parts in a car back and forth across the border just in time, and it's not just in time anymore, and all of a sudden we're losing market share and effectiveness and productivity. Campbell Soup has overcome a lot of that, but the problem, and I give two specific examples. Toyota can drop 2/3 of all Toyota cars in North America are dropped once. They are manufactured in Japan and they come one time across the border. That's why they are picking up market share. Campbell Soups, they have a competitor, China. I can buy a fresh can of, it's not you, but a fresh can of fruit for a certain amount, and then if I go to a store in Florida, I can buy it 20% cheaper because it comes from China. Canned fruit from China. And by the way, the quality is not quite as good, but it's for 20% cheaper, it does its price. So aren't we losing something? And I address this to Mr. Alden and to Mr. Sands. Aren't we losing something here by losing the idea of economic competition? America is in a disastrous state. Canada is being pulled into the maelstrom. The reason for that, more than anything that I can see, is that we're economically uncompetitive. And this border is driving us down the wrong path. So it's counterintuitive. On one hand, we say we have to be secure, and on the other hand, we're becoming competitively uncompetitive. So I don't know how the United States is going to pull itself out of its trade surplus situation unless they can produce products that are more economically competitive. 2 years ago, the American worker was 15% more productive than a Canadian worker. Now, I think that number is collapsing, but now we're very uncompetitive with Europe. We're very uncompetitive with China. And so the macro issue that really, in my view, erodes the micro issue is that we're going into a downward spiral, and the border is causing us to go down faster and quicker than ever before. So you, Mr. Sands, say we got to go along because somebody in the United States is worried about security from Canada. And I saw your chart, Mr. Alden, and I agree with you. But quite frankly, it's a false analogy. It is, in my view, a false analogy because some guy in Washington is saying this is a big threat. So how do we bring what I believed Benjamin Franklin brought to issues, some common sense? How do we bring some economic common sense when taxpayers are going to be...
have a shot at it. I think we're going to run out of time.
Okay, I apologize, but it's a systemic question.
Very important. Sure.
No, I think it's a critical question, and it was a lot of the focus of my book, in fact. I think one of the things that happened after 9/11 was that you had federal agencies which really did have very much of a dual mission. I mean, the old Customs Service was at least as much, probably more about facilitation than it was about security, though it had a dual mission. And I think we moved after 9/11 very much to a security first, security only kind of mission. I think some of the balance has begun to be restored, but there are big problems there. realistically, we are not going to move back to a situation where we say security, economic competitiveness. Well, economic competitiveness is more important. We're going to let security go. I don't see us going back that direction. I think that approach, for a lot of different reasons, was discredited by the events of 9/11. I mean, there were a lot of things that were done in the name of economics before 9/11 to prevent sensible security accommodations. I could give you a big list, but I won't, that weren't done. And I think that mistake is not going to be made again. So the challenge is exactly what is being worked on in this room, is to find ways to do both effectively. And what I would argue for is to get past the tyranny of small differences. And a great example of this is pre-clearance, which would be so important for your company. I mean, the negotiations between the U.S. and Canada basically broke down over what I consider a very small issue, which is essentially whether, U.S. authorities, people wearing that uniform, would have arrest power on Canadian soil. Would be able to take people who came in who they were afraid were probing U.S. weaknesses and detain them, even if that person decided, well, no, actually, I'm not going to enter the United States, I'm going to turn around. It seems to me there's no reason that two countries as close as the United States and Canada cannot work out a protocol for dealing with that sort of issue. So I think that's where we need to make the progress, not to say that economics is more important than security or vice versa, but to say, look, let's be creative and reasonable about how we try to do both these things and not stand on what really amount to small points of difference that prevent cooperative initiatives that really could make an important practical difference.
Okay. Yeah, quick shot. Three quick points. One, cosmically, I think you're onto something. What we've shown in the United States, I think unfortunately, but understandably, is that we're fair weather integrationists. First with September 11, we looked to the neighbors, but we ultimately circled the wagons. Now, I think that's understandable in the shock of the moment, but we needed to move away from that. Now in an economic crisis, and I don't want to pick on the Congress people, but we also have turned to a lot of economic nationalism to solve the economic crisis, buy American provisions and so on. The difference between the U.S. and other countries is that as the regional hegemon, if not globally, we do have an influence on how other countries respond. If you go back to, say, the middle of the Reagan administration, when we started really pushing for a lowering of barriers, we went about 16 years sending the message, we want lower barriers, easier commerce. And countries adapted. Countries that didn't necessarily go for that have now developing countries are clamoring for fewer barriers. That's really the power of the U.S. But if we send a signal between George W. Bush and Barack Obama of America first on both security and economy, don't think that the world won't respond. And I think that does hurt us globally, not just Canada and the U.S., for prosperity. So I'm worried about that as a cosmic. Second, I agree with Ted. My grandparents grew up in the city of Detroit. It was a wonderful place, and when they grew up, they didn't lock their door when they went to church or went to the grocery. Nobody in Detroit would think of not locking your door now, even if your house doesn't look like it has anything in it. People still lock their doors. There is a sense that we have of nostalgia. Oh, it was so nice when we used to not have to lock our doors, but you can't go back. There is a certain amount of the security that's just part of a changed threat perception. And my grandparents didn't lock the doors because the neighbors were suspicious. It's because there were bad people out there. So we need to not feel insulted that we're putting some barriers on security. It's not an insult to Canada. It's not we don't trust Canadians. It's that there are bad people out there, and that's why you have to be a little more prudent. Lastly, I think that this is one of the reasons I think regionalism is so important. You really have to be able to test some of these ideas away from the grand theory in practical ways. I think the Enhanced Driver's License Project, which PNWER and Don's group at the Border Policy Research Institute really have looked at, where we've really looked for ideas that try to capture some of what the other gentleman was saying, that the local, ingenuity, but also addressing these global problems. Because there's no doubt moving the federal government of this country or yours is hard. It's like steering a giant aircraft carrier, whereas moving at the local level is a lot easier and people can participate more readily. So I do think that's part of the solution as well.
Promise one more over here because we have to quit. So, Scotty.
Thanks. Fantastic discussion. Two really quick things. One is on the, and you touched on it, but I just want to underscore it because Kelly raises something important and everyone's talked about it. If you want to do something to stimulate the economy that doesn't involve spending another $1 trillion, what you do is you allow law enforcement to be cross-trained so that the inspectors in Kelly's facility in Toronto, once they've already inspected the food, ensured that it's safe, that their seal will also be approved by Michelle's people at the border, not your people, different crossing, but so that you have cross-trained law enforcement in the facility at the point of manufacturing, and they can sail through the border instead of being stopped. That's one idea, and Kelly, we should go talk to Congressman Larson right after this meeting. Another example, though, of something that would save Campbell's money, because they don't have to fill out those 12 forms every single time, since they've already been inspected and they've already done it once. It would save the government money because they've only got one person doing one person's job instead of 3 people doing one person's job. So it would save delays at the border. I mean, it would just have a ripple effect in terms of economic stimulus, and that's how you get the political energy to do something today, is for economic stimulus. It doesn't cost anybody meaningfully more money. The other example that Kelly didn't raise, but I'll raise it, which is related since we're talking about soup, I believe this is right, Kelly. If you're making vegetable barley soup, you're regulated by USDA. If you're making beef and vegetable barley soup, you're regulated by FDA, or the other way around.
Other way around, yeah.
So the point is, you have 2 different agencies of the U.S. federal government. Now, if there is a truck that contains both vegetable soup and vegetable beef barley soup, beef and veggies. You've got 2 different agencies. You've got the food inspection people. You've got the people that are worried about mad cow, and you've got the people at the border who are worried about the driver immigration, et cetera. And that's crazy. DHS has brought a lot of law enforcement together. Where there's a will, there's a way. If the government will just decide to cross-train its agents, it'll work. That's the first thing. Really quickly, the second thing is, I just want to suggest a completely different idea about security. We are ships passing in the night because we are talking about the economics and what needs to be done to deal with the economics, but we're also talking about the physical land security. What we need to do, I think, is what the military war colleges do when they talk about economic warfare. Right? This is something that the DHS and students of the border don't do. We need to look at economic warfare, because we spend a lot of time in our militaries looking at making sure we have critical infrastructure protection, we're protecting our markets, we're not disrupting the internet, the electricity grid, et cetera. And that's a very serious national security concern that our military looks at every day. We look at disrupting other people's economies, we look at protecting our own economy from disruption. The Canada-U.S. relationship is so economic that we need to put the economic security equation. It's not just economic prosperity versus physical security. It's economic security as a serious national interest. And I think we need to put that military approach into DHS, and then we could make progress.
I think we have our idea of the day. We go from the smart border. In honor of Kelly, we'll call it the souped-up border.
Whatever works.
Thank you all very much. Matt, you want to make a comment about?
No, I will. We're on a very tight schedule as usual, and I'm going to be the taskmaster. We need to be seated in 15 minutes because the governor's on a schedule. She's going to start speaking at 12:15, and then she's going to have to leave. So collect your papers. We're going to be back here after lunch. If you want to, you can leave stuff here. No one's going to come and move it or take it with you, but we're going to go up the stairs here to the 6th floor. When you get up the stairs, go left. Thank you.
Great job. Great. You too. That book.
Yeah,
I enjoyed your presentation. Really good stuff. Yeah.